On behalf of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, I would like to thank the Arab Network of National Human Rights Institutions and the National Council for Human Rights of Egypt for their invitation to participate in this very important international conference. I must say that it is a pleasure to see the Arab Network of National Human Rights Institutions and the host National Council for Human Rights are both chaired by ladies. I would like to reiterate publicly my congratulations to both for their recent appointments as chairpersons of their respective A-status human rights institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject and the theme of this conference is of primary importance since, as we know, national human rights institutions, especially those in full compliance with the Paris Principles, play a central role in assisting their respective governments in implementing their international obligations to promote and protect human rights at domestic level. Thus, in this framework, we will discuss how you, the national human rights institutions, can play your primordial role in the realizations of the Sustainable Development Goals. The national human rights institutions' contribution to this process and the 2030 Agenda has been subject of many gatherings in the past, including Gandhi Conference in Merida, Mexico, in October 2015, right after the adoption of the goals on 25th of September of the same year. During these 2 days, we are mainly focusing on the Sustainable Development Goal 16, aimed at achieving peace, justice, and strong institutions by promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. As you may know, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights is the custodian of a number of indicators under this goal, such as conflict-related death, indicator 16.1.2, killings and other attacks against human defenders, journalists, and trade unionists, 16.10.1, independent national human rights institutions, indicators 16.A.1, and prevalence of discrimination and harassment, indicators 16.B.1. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to measure the progress toward the achievement of the goals, the United Nations Statistics Division prepares every year a report which includes the information gathered during the past year by each United Nations custodian agency and department. The annual report 2021 on Sustainable Development Goal 16, while it recognizes progress under some targets and indicators, it still highlights the need to be more active. In a nutshell, I will share with you some of the findings of this report. For instance, despite the United Nations call for ceasefire all over the world to protect civilians, under indicator 16.1.2 entitled Conflict-Related Deaths per 100,000 Population by Sex, Age, and Cause, it is reported that unfortunately civilian deaths in armed conflict persists, with progress made even in most regions. In 2020, 5 civilians per 100,000 people were killed in armed conflicts, and 1 in 7 of those deaths was a woman or a child. According to the data, most civilian killings were by small and light weapons. Indicator 16.2.1 on the proportion of children aged 1 to 17 years old who experience any physical punishment and/or psychological aggression by caregivers, the report relates that even before the COVID-19 outbreak, widespread violence was already available. And between 2012 and to 2020, in 77 countries with available data, 8 in 10 children from the age of 1 to 14 were subject to some form of psychological aggression and/or physical punishment at home. In this respect, national human rights institutions are required to encourage their respective governments to draft and propose to the Parliament the adoption of a law to criminalize domestic violence. National human rights institutions should thereafter provide training to law enforcement and the judiciary to apply the law as it is required and not to consider domestic violence as a family issue. Indicator 16.2.2, number of victims of human trafficking per 100,000 population by sex, age, and form of exploitation. According to the annual report, the proportion of women trafficked continues to be higher than the men, and they are mainly exploited in sex industry, while trafficked men are mainly exploited in forced labor. In this respect, again, national human rights institutions should ensure that their domestic legislation criminalizes trafficking, and in this regard, trafficked persons are considered as victims and not criminals. They should be provided with the adequate support to start a new life with dignity and respect. While the foremost in providing access to justice for all is ensuring fair trial within a reasonable period, under indicator 16.3.2 on unsentenced detainees as a proportion on overall prison population, unfortunately, it is reported there has been no progress since 2019 in the proportion of detainees who have not yet been sentenced. National human rights institutions under their protection mandate are required to conduct regular visits to detention centers. During these visits, in addition to other monitoring functions such as overpopulation, ill treatment, hygiene, food quality and quantity, they should pay attention to the status of the detainees, whether they have been sentenced or not yet. In case not, they have to make sure that the detainees are brought before judges without any delay. Under the indicator 16.10.1 on number of verified cases of killing, kidnapping, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention and torture of journalists, associated media personnel, trade unionists, and human rights advocates, according to the report, unfortunately in 2020, 331 human rights defenders were killed in 32 countries, which constitutes a right, raise of 18% compared to 2019. For the United Nations, the main reason for such killings remain impunity. In this respect, national human rights institutions are on one hand encouraged to promote the freedom of speech and associations in their respective countries and monitor the civic space to prevent any attempt of its shrinking. On the other hand, the national human rights institutions are encouraged to promote justice, accountability, the rule of law, and embark the government and the judiciary on fight against impunity. Indicator 16.b.1, proportion of population reporting having personally felt discrimination against or harassed in the previous 12 months on the basis of a ground of discrimination prohibited under international human rights law. It is reported that the percentage of women victims of discrimination is higher than for men. From every 3 persons with disabilities, at least 1 has reported to have been subject to discrimination on the grounds of gender, ethnicity, and religion on an average of 1.5 times more than other persons. Under their protection mandate, national human rights institutions receive complaints which they investigate, and in case of a violation, ensure that the perpetrator is brought to justice and the victim receives a remedy. In systemic violations, such as discrimination on certain grounds, national human rights institutions should go an extra mile to mobilize the national actors to adopt the relevant legislation to penalize discrimination regardless of its nature. The last but not least, indicator 16.8.1, existence of independent national human rights institutions in compliance with the Paris Principles. According to the report, there has been only modest gains in this field, which will not be enough to meet the 2030 target. The report calls for doubling efforts to establish and strengthen human rights institutions. As it stands now, there are 86 A status national human rights institutions and 32 B status worldwide. In addition to governments which have committed themselves to establish fully Paris Principle compliant NHRIs under the SDGs, it should be borne in mind that Article 18.4 of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Article 32.2 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities require the establishment of independent mechanisms in compliance with the Paris Principle to monitor at the national level the implementation of the optional protocol and the Convention. As you know, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights provides legal advice to the governments for the drafting of Paris Principles compliant legislation to establish national human rights institutions, and thereafter technical and advisory services to build and strengthen the capacity of these institutions. We have actually technical cooperation programs with a number of national human rights institutions present in this conference. Therefore, this is an open call to all national human rights institutions that have been assessed by GANRI's Subcommittee on Accreditation, or those institutions which have not yet sought accreditation, that OHCHR stands ready to provide the required technical assistance to them to ensure achieving full compliance with the Paris Principles. Since I don't have time, I will stop, but Mr. Chair, allow me on a personal note, I pay respect and tribute to the person who created this network in Mauritania in 2011, and except Mr. Sultan and Khalid Ramli from Morocco, I don't know if anyone else was there. I think we should remember Dr. Ali Al-Mari. This is his own vision for the Arab network, and I am happy to see the room full of all NHRIs of the region. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Doctor. And probably move reminding the speaker